Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Robert Inlakesh, here to discuss what's going on in the world, to get caught up, all these different perspectives on the many different fields of war, the many different propaganda tactics, the many different things going on in foreign policy, and, just to kind of get caught up on what he sees in the world today, because, very few people out there are as immersed in these topics as Robert is. So let's start off today, Robert. How are you, by the way? How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing as well as I possibly can be. And Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, my pleasure, brother. So let's start with whatever it is that's going on. There's so many different topics, obviously. I've got plenty of stuff lined up, but what today, what's the one thing that, if I asked you was the most pressing on your mind, what is it right now to you that jumps to the forefront?
It would definitely be what's happening in Gaza with the ongoing genocide and the escalation of airstrikes, and perhaps the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is a privatized aid project, which was spearheaded by the Israelis using American privatized companies, and also collaborating with ISIS-linked gangs that were previously used to loot aid and now continue to loot aid, but also attack people and are used to secure aid transfers, they claim. And now they're, advertising this ISIS-linked group of gangsters, criminals, and thugs as a grassroots resistance to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So that situation, and specifically looking at what's happening with the aid distribution sites, and Israel now having killed 600 Palestinians as they were seeking aid, essentially luring them into a death trap, offering them scraps of food and then shooting them when they try and get those scraps of food that they're offering. That would probably be the most pressing thing right now. But as you know, there's a range of different developments in the region. In any moment, one of them could explode and become the big news story. But I think, the Gaza story has faded, especially the issue of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The so-called Humanitarian Foundation, the way that they name these things is sadistic, in my opinion. That sort of faded from the headlines. Even when we're talking about Gaza, there's a lot of discussion of the bombings, but not as much focus on these aid sites, which Trump, by the way, has just pledged that he'll give $30 million to fund, which is essentially an assembly line mass murder project where you get people to herd towards an area, herd them like cattle towards slaughter.
Yeah, like references to Squid Game, Hunger Games. I mean, all these different analogy or comparisons that I think are very clearly apt. It's obvious what's been going on. We were covering this in the beginning, as I'm sure you were, about the very first day, and sort of your coverage of Shireen Abu Akleh and others. The story morphs in the first 48 hours. In the first, every day to day, the story changes from, no, we shot above them. Oh, no, it was them, or they shot first. And until, it just drifts away. And then the next day, the day after that, multiple reports of continued shooting. It just drifted away. Right. So they have been executing people in these lines. It's just grotesque. Doctors' testimony about it. So before we get into that, and I want to hear more about the, just the whole dynamic and how you see this going forward. But you mentioned the ISIS link group. So let's talk about that first. Give people listening more insight on the GHF, the Gaza Health Foundation, the ridiculous fake, whatever. Give us insight into that group, the Mossad overlap, the manipulation that it is, and the ISIS linked groups. And, any way you want to go around that, because as you clearly indicated there, this is not a new dynamic, the new rebels fighting like the new moderate rebels kind of a game. So talk about the foundation and really give us some deep background on the ISIS linked group. I want to hear more about that.
Well, I think addressing the ISIS-linked gangs and then putting that together with what's happening with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is where this conversation should start. Because these gangsters, which are led by a criminal named Yasser Abu Shabab, were essentially used by the Israelis after Israel invaded Rafah in southern Gaza last year. They essentially created a safe zone for them, which is a kill zone for anyone else, including, emergency workers. If there's a bombing in the area and they want to inspect and they want to come close to this area, which is in the eastern portion of southern Gaza, they set up these gangsters there. And the only way that the aid trucks could go in was through this territory. And what the Israelis would do is they coordinated with these gangs, and they were a few hundred, they numbered a few hundred at the time, these gang members, who were primarily from a number of Bedouin tribes that exist in Gaza, but also their family links expand into what's now considered Israeli territory in the Naqab or Negev desert area, Beer-Seba as the major city there, and into the Egyptian Sinai. And so these groups, and it's not by any means to say that the entire Bedouin families are like this. In fact, the families have officially condemned these militants at this point, but they drew from these families and specifically focused on recruiting criminals who had escaped from jails in the Gaza Strip, police stations that were bombed. The entrances were bombed by the Israelis at the beginning of the genocide in 2023. And these individuals who, like Yasser Abu Shabab, guilty of trafficking drugs. There's others. There's one guy, his name is Shadi Asufi. He was a convicted murderer who had fled to the Sinai at one point to try and evade the law in the Gaza Strip and be arrested. He was set to be executed before Israel bombed the prison and allowed him to exit.
Set to be executed by who? Who was the one saying that? By Gaza authorities or from Israeli authorities?
The Gaza authorities. So
okay,
the authorities, Hamas, obviously, were the government in Gaza. And so they had a police force, of course, and a security apparatus. And so they would do things like, for instance, crack down on the smuggling of drugs across the Egyptian border. And it was these groups that we now see today, these thugs that we see today, who were involved in facilitating the transfer of drugs into the Gaza Strip, and long known, many of them as well, to be collaborators with the Israelis and to have spied and committed murder, trafficking, all sorts of these crimes. So these are criminals, essentially. Mm-hmm. These are outlaws. Israel then used these outlaws when the time, an opportune time came for them, which was when they invaded Rafah. Because before, what had happened in the Gaza Strip is they had tried to use collaborators in order to steal the aid, to sow chaos, to attack and even replace, that's what their aim was, to replace the internal security force, which obviously is linked to Hamas, with these thugs. But they didn't get away with it until Rafah was invaded and Israel got full control over the Egyptian Gaza border area. Mm-hmm. And so then, like I was explaining before, the aid had to come in specifically under Israeli supervision. There was no policeman there. The Hamas police couldn't get near this area to try and secure the aid, or they would be killed. They were taken out in airstrikes. And so when the international organizations, the humanitarian organizations, would bring in food aid, they would bring in fuel or whatever they would bring in the small quantities which were allowed in. And this is something that not all of them could say outright. They couldn't admit it because, of course, you can't admit to every single time you take aid into Gaza, you have to pay a bribe.
Right.
But they were forced to pay bribes to Abu Shabab, who runs this ISIS-linked gang that operates under full Israeli supervision. Now we've seen they have Israeli tactical vests, Israeli military helmets, Israeli weapons that were supplied to them. These humanitarian organizations had to send their trucks for there. So they would either pay the bribe or they would be ambushed and the food would be taken and essentially brought to these warehouses, which the Israelis have full view and knowledge of. And then what Abu Shabab's men would do is that they would take this food aid and they would drip feed it into different areas in Gaza onto the black market. Mm-hmm. And what happened because of that, and because the humanitarian organizations really didn't have a choice, they had to pay the bribes. They had to just accept that bunches of their aid, and sometimes the entire aid truck, would be looted and taken away. They essentially unfortunately accepted the situation where the prices were hiked up at the markets for food in Gaza. So only if you were wealthy enough would you be able to buy food to feed your family from these markets. And the aid that came in was not enough for the people, as we saw over a large period of time now, especially children, the elderly, vulnerable people, people with pre-existing medical conditions have died of starvation, malnutrition. Many people have different chronic illnesses that have come on because of the conditions that they're living under. And then what happened after the ceasefire came in earlier this year and Israel violated it is they transformed this criminal militia into a grassroots resistance against Hamas, they're saying. And then this militia force now carries out operations against Hamas for the Israelis. And also what it does, aside from looting aid, continuing to do that, and there are definitely cases, documented cases where they've done this, they also are collaborating, and they are the force that is supposed to be, at least on paper, securing aid transfers with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Mm-hmm. So all of this is interlinked. And we haven't even gotten into the ISIS links to these groups, because these, many of these militants, these criminals, were either formerly members of Daesh, the black branch of Daesh, or ISIS, which emerged in the Gaza Strip in 2015, which Hamas cracked down on and destroyed that very same year. It tried to come back in waves after that. Hamas had to confront it. In 2018, ISIS declared war on Hamas because it was cracking down on these groups. But they were also part of different Salafist groups linked to Al-Qaeda. These thugs and these criminals who operate in these same networks, going all the way back into the late 2000s. So we're talking about people who have been hardened Salafist militants, combined with your common thieves and criminals and murderers who have essentially collaborated with the Israelis and been armed by the Israelis as a so-called grassroots resistance to Hamas, which nobody in Gaza accepts, by the way. But unfortunately, they have to accept that they exist and that the aid is coming in that way because they don't have anything to eat.
Before we go on to those many other points that we're going to flesh out, the point about right there where you highlighted about the emergence of that ISIS element in Gaza, what's your opinion on that? We've talked in the past, you and I, about the obvious general sentiment of ISIS, Al-Qaeda being essentially proxy elements of these powers. That's a very nuanced conversation. There's many moving parts to it, as you've pointed out. But so in your opinion right there, is that an organic thing that was then pushed back? I mean, it's obvious to show that ISIS and Hamas are not the same thing. And that many overlapping examples throughout the years show you that ISIS is very close to the Israeli-U.S. kind of establishment. But in that moment, is that an organic thing? Or do you think that's something they created and kept trying to institute in that location? What's your opinion on that?
My opinion, and I don't have proof that the Israelis set up the Gaza wing of ISIS in 2015, but my guess would be that they were implicated in it. I don't see how these groups were operating otherwise, and especially even the declaration of war against Hamas and how antithetical they were. Even in 2015, ISIS fought to capture the Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria. And so Hamas, which had sided with the Syrian opposition, by the way, fought against ISIS. And one of their top commanders was captured by ISIS. Hamas and the other opposition groups were defeated by ISIS in this battle. And a Hamas commander was beheaded by ISIS. And that was the same year that ISIS then coincidentally just pops up in Gaza. Now that they've had this battle with Hamas obviously cracked down on them. But we've seen that these Salafist elements and these Al-Qaeda-linked elements were active in Gaza, were committing suicide bombings, kidnappings of journalists, and activists as well, the murder of activists in the Gaza Strip for a very long time. There were massive clashes between Hamas, their security forces, and Al-Qaeda cells throughout the history of the Hamas rule of the Gaza Strip, they constantly had to crack down on them. They had to arrest the ringleaders in these terrorist cells, and they fought, gun battles in the streets with these militants. So there's a long history of that in the Gaza Strip. Not only that, but another thing, which is, I suppose, anecdote on the side, which supports the notion of Israeli involvement with these groups, is that there were many times where Hamas arrested members of these Salafist groups for firing rockets at Israel, these sort of bottle rockets that they'd fire over, which would then invite an Israeli response.
Right.
So there were these times where randomly, and when nothing was happening, seemingly, there would be 1 or 2 rockets fired over, and they would just land in open areas, and they wouldn't pose a threat to anyone. And then suddenly that invited an Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip. And these groups did that. These are the groups that participated in that, and Hamas, their policemen, arrested these people for it.
The implication clearly being, at least not saying proof, but the implication being that possibly if they're working on behalf of this element, which there's ties you can prove, that was done for the interest of the desire to launch that attack for whatever reason, as we were very clearly seeing today, as it's coming out for the 15th time over the years, where Israeli media and Israeli people are highlighting that Netanyahu's once again conducting war to keep himself out of jail, and so that's one very easily proven and obvious potential point there. But that's just fascinating to see how many different ways this interconnects and how long this has been going on. So in regard to the ISIS links and the GHF connected back to Israel and the United States as well, first the ISIS links in general. So that's important. So regardless of being ISIS connected, these groups are what we just described, right? It's interesting, but then what makes it all the more insulting is to prove that, the very group they're always trying to highlight is what they're fighting around the world is in fact doing their dirty work right on the ground, which is not new. So go into what that is. And if you have any other examples of why it's not new, I'd love to hear that too.
No, it's definitely not new. Like, evidently, we know in the case of Syria, the Israelis were backing at least a dozen Syrian opposition groups since 2013, one of them being Nusra Front, which was commanded by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who's now known as Ahmed al-Shara. He's the Syrian president now, who turned his organization. He changed the name from Nusra to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which now runs Syria today. But it's interesting because at the same time in 2013, when these groups started getting funded, many of them were collaborating, including Nusra, by the way. At the same time that Nusra was collaborating and working together with ISIS in Syria, the Israelis were simultaneously providing funding and weapons over to the group. So, and that's now the guy who is running Syria, who headed that organization. And it's no surprise to anyone that he's now moving towards a normalization agreement with the Israelis. But, the Syria element to this obviously proves the point. It's the strongest, proof here. But also in the Gaza Strip now, these people, many of these militants who are, hardened Salafists, who were either loyal to ISIS or Al-Qaeda movements in the past, are now openly collaborating with the Israelis to overthrow Hamas. And then, of course, it's funny because Yasser Abu Shabab, the sort of ringleader, he was interviewed on no other than the Israeli army radio, to which he told the army radio that all the claims that we're collaborating with Israel is just propaganda, Hamas propaganda, while he's speaking to Israeli army radio from a territory controlled by the Israelis, where they provide him with air support. So, I mean, at this point, those links are crystal clear. We have lots of historical examples of Hamas fighting against Al-Qaeda and against ISIS, of course. But now the Israelis, they let the cat out of the bag. And even Netanyahu, he was forced to admit, because of Victor Lieberman and others in the Knesset, brought up the fact that why are we funding ISIS? Maybe this could have blowback. That was their point of view. Mm-hmm. Like this could at some point backfire on us. And so he admitted, no, there's nothing wrong with funding these people. Like this is a strategy against Hamas.
Right.
So they've openly admitted it at this point. So it's not even something that we have to debate right now whether it's happening. We can talk about past examples. You know, in 2015, was the rise of ISIS in Gaza financed by the Israelis or something like that, which we don't have proof for. We can just speculate. But now it's out in the open. These are hardened militants, some of them, and criminals. And that's really what they are. They're collaborators and criminals more than they are ideologically committed to anything. But of course, if you allow these people to take over, which they're not powerful enough to do, but if you were allowed to allow these people to take over, they would rain terror on the people of the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis are completely fine with that.
And they're already doing that, as you've recovered many times, right? The ethnic cleansing, all the white massacres. I mean, it's been going on since the beginning. And that's the most cartoonish part of all this, is that, like you described, Jolani or whatever, what is he calling himself now? Or is that his new name? Yeah. So basically now it's the group that was moments ago, he had a $10 million bounty on his head. The group they claim they're fighting, and just on a dime becomes the man in the suit, and Trump's there taking a picture next to him. It's just so silly. And the ongoing claims, and, the Israel sweeps in and starts building bases and has names for settlements. It's insulting to our intelligence to not be obvious about what that is, but what's interesting is it's not even, as you said, there are precedents around them doing that in general, or rather specifically with these groups, but it's also in general, you can see that they've done this before, as we've discussed many times. And again, to be fair, very nuanced situation. It's not as simple as to say they just control them, but Israel has been shown to get money in the hands of Hamas many times in order to keep them divided and keep the Palestinian people divided. So even in that context, you can see, I think the point is they'll throw money at whoever for whatever reason, as long as it suits their interest. And there's nobody that is, unsavory enough for them, is the kind of point. And they'll put money in the hands of anybody to achieve the ends. And it turns around and then points to those very people as the boogeyman they need to save you from. That's textbook U.S. policy as well, right in front of us.
Yeah, we've discussed the Hamas situation, which I think is rather different to this, because Hamas, when we're talking about the money going to Hamas, we're talking about Qatari money, which was before going to Hamas, but they just changed the method of it. And obviously it came in suitcases for a period of time. And this happened not just with Netanyahu, but with Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett as well. Those funds came through. But they obviously, in that situation, they didn't have a solution for Gaza. This is something that I think everyone can agree upon. They didn't have a solution for Gaza. So they understood that if they just let the situation deteriorate to a point of collapse in the Gaza Strip before, and block all money coming in, and no salaries could be paid in the Gaza Strip, then it would disintegrate into a situation of chaos, and it would beget war, and it would cause a problem and a nuisance for the Israelis. The Israelis wanted to sideline the Gaza issue, and so they allowed this money to come in to allow salaries to be paid and the likes, and that's why the funds had come in. And another element of it, of course, is definitely keeping the Palestinian people divided, but that is more so what they did on the Palestinian Authority side. The Palestinian Authority are essentially a full collaborator force with the Israelis. They do their bidding at every single turn, and they crack down on grassroots resistance in the West Bank. And even when Hamas in 2017 tried to sign an agreement to bring the Palestinian Authority, despite all of their flaws, into control of the Gaza Strip, they wanted them to take over the civil administration. Israel and the United States collapsed it. So they could have actually achieved this so-called, taking Hamas out of power. That could have been achieved in 2017, but they refused to do so. So it's another point against them. But you're correct that they'll throw money at anything and anyone in order to try and serve their aims in the short term. And then they turn around and cry victim when suddenly things don't go their way. And even this could be the case in Syria. Many of those groups that received funding and were operating in Idlib, tomorrow there could be a revolution in Syria and some of those groups could take over. If that happens, now you might have a government in Damascus which is adversarial to the Israelis. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but there are certainly lots of groups there that are still adversarial to Israel. So, and then they'll cry victim, but it's like, well, you endorsed this, you endorsed this whole experiment, and then you were trying to normalize with one of your allies, Ahmed al-Shara, who you funded since 2013, despite knowing that he was a commander of ISIS and that the group he was commanding was Al-Qaeda in Syria, and it still is Al-Qaeda in Syria. The only difference is the leadership of this Al-Qaeda group is controlled by foreign intelligence agencies. Ahmed al-Shara or Jolani has always been an asset of the MI6, and the others are different assets for other intelligence agencies. But underneath that, the militants that are parts of these groups actually do adhere to the Al-Qaeda Salafist mentality, and they do hate Israel. So at any moment, that project could collapse, and then suddenly you've got all these people who want to attack you, and then they'll cry victim.
Which they could still use, though. I think that's the mindset, is that even if it spins out of control, it kind of makes their point real. You know what I mean? Like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, what's so fascinating, the picture you paint there is, I mean, you have to realize if you can prove these assets at the top, which is what they are, you know, and I think even was it Mohammed bin Salman that essentially admitted that at one point, where he said that, you know, pointing out that, yes, they essentially are behind a lot of these groups, but some of the people, like two things, that the leadership don't necessarily believe, like you just said, in the ideology. It's more of a tool of manipulation, but it kind of said in so many words that they've lost control, some of these groups. Like I forget what year that was, but I remember there was a time where he was really speaking out a lot. Like, I think it was around the Yemen point, or it does not to get into, I'm forgetting exact mindset, but the point that he said that publicly shows you that, you know, maybe that he's distancing himself from the loss of that control, but really the idea that ultimately they are out there trying, just throwing things into the situation, not caring that what they're doing, like you said, could spin out and hurt the very people on the ground that they always profess to care about, you know. But that picture is so clear. We're talking about leaders, you know, CIA, Mossad, MI6, like leadership moments that are guiding all of this chaos. How can we ever stand back and pretend like those are the people trying to give us liberty and freedom and democracy? You know, it's so insulting to our intelligence, but it's a good picture you painted there. But good.
No, I just say, like, this is the issue here, is that every single time they pull off all these operations, or they might assassinate leaders in a certain group, or commit terrorist attacks somewhere using the Mossad, or overthrow a government, and then suddenly after that government is overthrown, or they assassinated a leader, and suddenly a group or a country has become more hostile towards them, or a resistance forms, suddenly then they're crying victim. And just as a small point to take note of, everybody, you know, talking about Hezbollah terrorist, Hezbollah. And a lot of people don't know this, but when the Israelis entered into South Lebanon in 1982, the Shia population, which is what brought us Hezbollah, that's where the Lebanese resistance comes from, is from the Shia. At that time, there's video footage of this. They were throwing rice at the feet of the Israeli soldiers. Many of them actually supported, not all of them, of course, but many Shia in the south actually supported the Israelis coming in. You know why? Because they, at that time, as you know, they weren't politicized in the way that they are today. They believed that the PLO had a state within a state in their country, and they saw some of the activities of the PLO, and you know, that was not to their benefit. You know, they were actually being undermined because of the PLO in some ways. And so that created this anger, and a lot of the propaganda got through to these people, and they actually celebrated. But what happened when the Israelis actually came into South Lebanon? Well, they bombed civilian areas. They committed massacres against civilians on the ground. And then after 1982, when the Palestinian resistance left to North Africa, to Tunisia, the Israelis used their Phalange militia, the Lebanese Christian militia, to commit the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and then commit subsequent massacres against Palestinian refugees, but also against Lebanese Shia as well. Right. And they occupied the south of Lebanon. And that is what birthed in 1985 Hezbollah, from a population that prior to that was not actually active in the struggle. There was the Amal movement, but the Amal movement was not as hardline at that point. It actually had a lot of problems with the PLO. It would take a bit of time to get into that that equation there. But, in general, they did not have a population in South Lebanon like it is today.
Mm-hmm.
They created that by killing them, by subjugating them, by occupying them. And then they turn around and they go, why do these people hate us? And why are they firing ballistic missiles at us? But it's like, well, because you committed massacres against them. And
Right.
even today, they say, well, the pager attack was so specific. The majority of the people injured in the pager attack were not Hezbollah militants.
Right.
The majority of people injured in the pager attacks, even if they were family members or part of the party, were civilians in a civilian capacity in civilian areas. Women and children were killed in the attacks, but they praise how wonderful this pager attack is. No, when you do something like that, you turn an entire population against you. You
Right.
you radicalize them against you, and you make them want to resist. So they praise it in the so-called objective Western media. They praise terrorist attacks like this, and then they turn around and cry victim.
Right. Well, I mean, this is textbook terrorism. I mean, and anybody honest can see that. Was it over 70% of them were women and children? I mean, have you seen some of these lineups of just the most gruesome examples of them? Like I saw a picture, I think it was like 7 or 8 children and women and kids standing there with like missing eyes, an arm missing, like horrible things, and that they claim that they let it sit there for 10 years. I think the evidence shows it was about 5, but just floated around the community. I mean, the side point is obviously the concern of the infiltration of that kind of field in the US or anywhere else, and whether that's something that's going on today, Samson option kind of stuff. We know where that mindset is, that's really terrifying, but the overlap to that, the ongoing violation of everything they're doing. I mean, it's so obvious that what they're doing is everything they've always claimed they're fighting, and how frustrating it is to see all these corporate media entities like that go after it, praise it. It just shows you how compromised all this is. And that's I mean, unless you want to get into it, it's a conversation for another day that deserves its own discussion about the potential level of infiltration, how compromised governments are. I mean, I just think that's one of the conversations of the day. Like, we really need to start understanding how much and how obvious it is that Zionism has infiltrated a lot of these governments in the world. If you have a comment on that, go ahead, but it's a deep conversation,
It's a deep conversation, but there is absolutely no doubt at this point. I mean, what we're seeing from not just in the United States, but in Germany and in the United Kingdom, of these regimes and their stances. I mean, in the UK, they're designating Palestine Action, which basically goes to weapons factories, which provide the weapons to the Israelis to commit the genocide, and spray them with red paint or might knock out a few windows and stop the people from coming to work that day. They're designating them a terrorist organization in the UK. There's going to be a vote, I believe, on Wednesday about it in the British Parliament. And if that goes through, they're designating anti-war activists, most of whom came from the climate movement as well. Like, these are the kinds of people that they're calling terrorists in the West because of the Zionist lobby. And then there's no way of getting around it. These governments completely capitulate. And I'll add 100% capitulate to that pressure. And there's nobody that stands up. And that's because the political system is broken, and money for their campaigns and, getting reelected or gifts or being accepted in certain circles is more important to these politicians than their own constituents. They don't care. They don't care if that means killing children in a foreign country and sending weapons components, like Britain sends F-35 components. Still in Germany and the US are the biggest suppliers of arms to the Israelis. It doesn't matter if they're committing genocide with their weapons. They don't care.
Yeah, I do believe, though, as I think we've talked about before, that moment by moment, people are rapidly waking up to this. And I think that is a very clear reason why they're becoming more desperate by the moment. And I think that's why this seems to escalate, even against what would be classic kind of, justification for a little bit of restraint, whether or not they're belligerent. Like, they recognize that people start to see it for whatever reason, they seem to be pushing harder. I think they sense they're on a knife's edge, So on that very kind of note, what do you think about the potential, I mean, it's like, I almost feel like I don't even want to give it credence, the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza, because of how obviously they've continued to lie about it and how obviously they never seem to, they're lying to us about what they want to achieve. But just since it is popping back up on the point of a potential ceasefire in Gaza and Trump claiming he wants that again, what's your sentiment on that, on where that might go and where it is right now?
Well, I'm always hesitant to get excited about anything like this.
By the way, that's the wrong article I had up on the screen. So go ahead. I'll bring up the other one in a second. Go ahead.
Well, that links into it because they're saying that Donald Trump, he wants to try and push for the Israelis to drop the corruption trial against Netanyahu as part and parcel of achieving a ceasefire and a prisoner swap with Gaza. So it is actually relevant, that article that you pulled up. Look, at this point, we've had 21 months of these sorts of claims coming out about, there'll be a ceasefire at this time in 2 weeks. And, at Christmas, on Easter or whatever, a Ramadan ceasefire or whatever it will be. We've been experiencing this and we've been going through this time and time again for 21 months. And what I would say about it now as it stands is that the Israeli cabinet had a mini meeting yesterday. And members of the cabinet were informed that there had been no progress on the ceasefire. None. They hadn't made any progress because the Israelis will not cede to the key point that Hamas holds, which is that they want a full, comprehensive ceasefire, which is lasting. They want a lasting ceasefire. They don't want a ceasefire for 20 days or something like. They want the ceasefire to hold. And by the way, Hamas have already said, we will cede power in Gaza. We will cede power. They've said this. This has been their position for the best part of at least 6-7 months now that they've been open about this, perhaps longer. They've said, we will hand over the Gaza Strip to a interim administrative body, which is formed of experts and people and local leaders in the society to govern Gaza. We don't want to have a Hamas rule in Gaza. They've openly said it multiple times. Israel does not care about that. And Israel says even after, defeating Hamas, they want to keep going. They've repeatedly said this. So now we're hearing this talk. In my opinion, when we hear these kinds of announcements, it's normally to do with the Israeli domestic audience. Because after Iran struck the Israelis, the appetite for the war in Gaza decreased. It's weird because the support for Netanyahu increased because they believed a lot of his claims, but the appetite for the war in Gaza decreased because the people actually, got hit by a country that has the ability to properly defend itself for once. And so the Israeli population overwhelmingly wants a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange. Now, it's the vast majority of Israelis want it now. Because they want to wrap it up. And the reason for that is very clear. They say it openly. We're losing too much soldiers in Gaza. Our soldiers are being killed at a more rapid rate now. We don't know what we're doing. Our military operation is not working. And we want to get back to normal life. And so because that pressure is there, Netanyahu, he knows that, well, I need to give the people something to, feed on to sort of cool down, their sentiments and try and stop some of these protests again. Within the Israeli society, because he knows if he goes to a ceasefire and he doesn't achieve anything in Gaza, he's lost the war per his own announcements before his own people. There is a question about, okay, his real aim was a genocide, which we all know that his real aim was, okay, we're not going to crush Hamas, we're going to crush the Gazan people. And then by extension, what that would mean is basically that, once we ethnically cleanse Gaza, well, Hamas cannot exist then anyway, right? That was his real strategy, reading in between the lines and even reading their own statements. They say it openly. But his stated goals were crushing Hamas and returning the captives by force, which he's not been able to do. And so his coalition could collapse in on itself. And that's not just a bad thing if it goes to instant elections and he loses here, because he can't actually have a vote of no confidence against him now for about 5 months because the last one failed. But even next year, come the elections, if he loses his coalition partners, he's done as a politician. And then that corruption trial could come in and put him in jail. And he knows that.
Right.
And also, what is Israel after this? I don't think it's the same entity that existed before October 7. I think Israel no longer exists. It's trying to redefine itself. It's trying to expand its territory. It's trying to achieve victories where there's no victory to be achieved. And there is no Israel anymore. I don't think an Israel exists anymore. There is a genocidal entity which is trying to redefine its vision and redefine what it is.
Right.
And it's very divided as well. The Israeli society can't even figure out what Israel is anymore, or even what borders should be. So, all of this talk about ceasefire, it is possible. And I would say the largest, if it's going to happen, in my opinion, and I may be wrong, I've gotten things wrong before. I've gotten quite a few things wrong. I believe that it would be to clear the Gaza front out of the situation, to take Gaza out of the situation so that they can focus on Iran. That would be my guess. If there is a ceasefire that is reached, it would be purely so that they can focus on Iran and take Gaza out, because Gaza, in the case that there is an all-out regional war, Gaza could pose an enormous threat. They could. Especially the Israeli military is focused up north with a Hezbollah attack. It could pose an enormous threat. And I think they understand this.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So in a backward way, this could ultimately end up being a positive from Gaza's perspective, that this could drive them to want to take it for strategic reasons, which would, whatever causes it, at least a stopping for the moment would be good in Gaza, right? So, I mean, just on a quick side note, prediction, mark my words, everyone listening, I'm willing to bet you if that happens, here's what will follow. The Q community is going to warp this into Trump deliberately tricked Netanyahu into bombing Iran, therefore getting his attention over there to cause the ceasefire because he's the peace president. Watch. I'm willing to bet you anything that's what happens, even though that's absurdly ridiculous when you consider all the facts on the table. Before we go into the next part of it, though, there's a weird element to this in the ceasefire conversation that sort of lingered, and I wanted your thoughts on this because I haven't seen it covered that much. Now, there was a point put out, and I did confirm this with the actual back and forth, like the back and forth of the potential ceasefire points going around through the different mediators, which was that I think twice they put forward, like you just said, the idea that they would remove themselves from the conversation, which met what Israel pretends, at least, that it actually wanted to accomplish, when we know it's something more than that. But twice it seems that the Israeli-U.S. team denied that and then reinserted the language that kept them in, or changed it to where it kept them in as opposed to removing them. So would you have thoughts on that? Is that even valid? Because I had heard that would explain a lot, like that at the end of the day, when it comes to the real point, that they're trying to make sure Hamas sticks around because it's the justification for their endpoint. What do you think about that? And is there any evidence to that?
Well, Hamas have said, and they actually have said this for a long time, and Hamas have not wanted to govern independently. This is something for years that Hamas has wanted to form a unity government. You might remember that in 2014, there was a rather big attack on the Gaza Strip, which lasted, I believe, 51 days. And that started because Hamas had attempted to sign a unity agreement with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has time and time again tried to step down and allow others to govern. But it won't do that. It refuses to do that if that means sacrificing the weapons that protect people, that prevent there being an all-out ethnic cleansing. As horrible as what we've seen happen, unfold before our very eyes, the Palestinians still have the ability to fight the Israelis. It's not, an army against an army. These are guerrilla fighters against one of the best equipped armies on the planet, which doesn't actually fight, by the way. It's never actually tried to engage the Palestinian fighters. If it did so, then its casualties would be in the tens of thousands, I assure you. And they know that because in 2014, they went in on the ground against Hamas and they got their asses kicked. And that's why they haven't gone and tried to seek out Hamas. What they've done essentially is they've hid themselves in armored vehicles and in tanks. They've not even put infantry next to those tanks. And they've just hoped that, well, if an RPG hits the tank in an ambush or there's an IED that goes off, there's some injuries, we can quickly, evacuate them. And they haven't fought them directly. The only footage you can find of, in direct combat where there's, one force going after the other is Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, the DFLP, Fatah, or the other groups directly engaging the Israeli military. They never engaged them. There have been a handful of special forces operations. Most of them failed. I think only one of them succeeded against the Palestinian groups. Other than that, they've just sat in fortified areas and hid inside buildings, and they've been ambushed by the Palestinians. And that isn't in of itself a deterrent, because if you look in the West Bank, whatever Israel wants to do in the West Bank, it does.
Right.
It does anything it likes to do in the West Bank. And no one holds them back because the Palestinian Authority collaborate with them. So Hamas will not allow their weapons to them to drop their weapons. And they will not allow an agreement which will put a foreign entity in control of the Gaza Strip. They want a full ceasefire, and they want the people of Gaza to run, and they want the people of Gaza to still maintain a capacity, even if it's not Hamas being the banner anymore, and they say we're no longer Hamas, for them to possess a capability of self-defense. And so that's the major issue there, is that the Israelis do not want to allow Hamas to step aside and allow Gaza to govern its own affairs. And then those police forces and those resistance fighters to go, okay, now we're part of the Gaza administration, because they're still going to have their weapons.
Right.
They're still going to maintain a capacity to defend themselves, and they can govern themselves. And they know what's going to happen when they Gaza governs themselves. They will rebuild their territory, and if Israel tries to attack them again, they will defend themselves. And they don't want that. They want a defenseless people who are expelled from the land, or they're completely subdued and they are incapable of standing up for their rights. They want them there in a cage, in a concentration camp. And they don't have a solution for them. Their only solutions are either to expel the entire population or exterminate them all.
Right.
So that is the problem that the Israelis have, but they can't expel them all, because if they expel them all, then that destabilizes Egypt and Jordan. So then suddenly now you've opened up two more fronts against yourself.
Right.
So the Israelis are just genocidal maniacs with a country's population which overwhelmingly agrees with this genocidal mania. This is what they're carrying out. And there's no other way to describe it.
Yeah. And what's interesting is you can point this out. So exactly the point you made, which I think the evidence speaks for itself. The intention was a genocide. I think that's self-evident at this point. And so if your intention was always genocide, then even from a strategic standpoint, why would you send in all those troops? Why wouldn't you just, or, infantry? Why would you just bomb them into submission? You're like, well, submission is a different point. They're clearly not even doing that, but just bomb them relentlessly until you kill them all. I mean, my point is, it explains itself. You can see why they chose. Your point is also obviously there. They know they can't succeed in any right. But my point would be that there might be points where you might do that. The reason they seem not to is because they're not only sacrificing their own people in that way, as you can see endless videos of hidden Palestinian, military elements running up and putting bombs in the tanks, running away, because as you said, there's no one there to protect them, and it's just, they're willing to sacrifice those people because they know it's just about mass execution, at least as my opinion, but I think the evidence speaks for itself.
Well, there's the genocide there. And then there's the performance that has to be put on for the psychopathic, ill Israeli population. They're a nation that are sadistic and support overwhelmingly, according to all the polls, genocide.
Yep.
Overwhelmingly, they support genocide. So
The
this
majority
population.
Really quickly, the majority clearly does. That's proven time and time again. But I do think it's always valid to point out that there's not an insignificant amount of people that do stand up and push back on this stuff. But it's definitely minor and compared. And unless they're lying about it, which is possible, I do see, groups of Orthodox Jewish communities or people that are saying Zionism doesn't represent us. They're being genocided, and it's just large groups, but it's definitely a small minority. I think that's important to point out.
Jewish people are different, because then you're looking at other countries.
I meant just in Israel, though. But yeah. You're right. Go ahead.
The Israeli Jewish population, like the ultra Orthodox, are another question. They don't actively participate in the Israeli military, and their views, they don't really care about a modern nation state per se. And there are elements of them that have come out, and there are groups that protest against the Israelis' treatment of Palestinians. It's not the majority, by the way, but it is a portion. And then there's, some people that are more to the left. There's a very small portion of these people. It's a very, 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 very small portion of the Israeli population, but they do exist, of course. Of course, then you have Jewish people in other countries, which, are standing up, in all of the protests. And we see the actions of Jewish people in the UK or in Germany or in France or the United States, Canada, etc. That's another question. But In terms of the majority of the Israeli Jewish society, all the polls demonstrate they not only do they support genocide, killing everyone in a city that they capture when it comes to Gaza, they also overwhelmingly support not caring about civilian life when they're bombing Iran. They did polls on this recently. I think it's 73% of the Israeli Jewish population said they don't care, and they don't think there should be much consideration for civilians when bombing Iran. That is the population they're dealing with. And so the Israeli media and the Israeli political leadership have to deal with this psychotic population, which are quite frankly genocidal, the vast majority of them. And they have to convince them, you're winning, you're the heroes, but also you're victims at the same time. And Netanyahu's doing this, and then he's going to try to, and there's got to be this big theater. And that's why the army's in there, like Operation Gideon's Chariots 2, which just started around, I think a month ago now, I can't remember, was supposed to be phase 2 of the war. And I remember writing articles when it just started, and I said, this will be exactly more of the same of what we saw in the first phase, so-called, of the war. There will be nothing different. The Israeli military, I laid it out step by step. And exactly what I said happened. And now this Operation Gideon's Chariots, its wheels have fallen off. And it's achieved absolutely nothing. And they haven't done all these big operations, and we're going to go in and smash Hamas and Khan Yunis and in Deir al-Balah, and we're going to do this and this and this, and we're going to achieve victory over the terrorists and all of this. They haven't achieved that. And obviously they haven't achieved that. And now the Israeli populace go, oh, well, we're getting killed. Our soldiers are being killed. It's like, yeah, well, you're going and running incursions into areas where armed groups are. And these armed groups are people who've lost sometimes their entire families. And you're like, oh, our poor soldiers are being killed. So now there has to be a performance. And Netanyahu has to put on a performance for his psychotic population who are so insane that it's like, well, when we lose 7 soldiers, it's the end of the world, but it's okay that we massacred 50 children today. It's okay that we starved to death children today. It's okay that we tested new chemical munitions on them today. It's okay that we lured people into an aid point after starving them and then shot them in the head today. But how dare our 19-year-old sergeants, which is another thing of their participation trophy army, it's not a real army, 19-year-old sergeants. Oh no, 6 of our 19-year-old sergeants, which were placed in 1 armored personnel carrier, were killed today. Oh my God, we need a ceasefire. Oh, we're suffering. Oh, it's so horrible. And then here comes the performance by Netanyahu to make them feel good about themselves, just like when they kept delaying Gideon's chariot. And the performance came. These statements by Eyal Zamir, the chief of staff of the Israeli military, we will launch a crushing blow against Hamas, and we are going to destroy them, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. All these statements about we have new weapons, and the U.S. have given us this, and then they go in and nothing happens. It's just more bombing of civilian areas, and then their troops go in and do exactly what they did before and get killed. I don't know. You can't make this stuff up. It's just so psychotic, and covering it quite frankly, it gives you a headache. It gives you a headache trying to, because even as I'm explaining it to you, I can't contain myself but to use words like psychotic and sadistic because it's so insane.
It is. I mean, it's
no way to remain objective. It's just insane.
It is. And it's, you know what it is, Robert, at least in my opinion, is that it's obvious. It's when you're looking at something that is self-evident, and they're just making up a narrative around why it's not that. And then that alone is frustrating, but then that you get these massive influential groups of people who you clearly know, they know that's not true. They don't care. And then create these narrative stories around the lie. And that becomes this massive thing. It's like exhausting that we even have to, why do we even have to step into that ridiculous conversation? Like, I get it. It's overwhelmingly frustrating, but I think what's the whole thing is that clearly we all can see based on the evidence, what's actually taking place. We should stop, even giving these people time about the arguments. The problem is that they have influence, they've got funding, they've got resources, and clearly they do have an effect on some people. Back to my point, though, is I think that most people are seeing this because of work like yours, because of the efforts that we're continuing to put forward. And I think there's something, powerful there, but it's only going to get crazier. They're only going to get more absurd and more forceful and scream more racism, as this continues on. So I think that the point is to keep doing what we're doing and keep highlighting this. I know you have a short limited time. We're up against the hour here. You want to talk about Iran before we go today, a little bit more about the same kind of stuff we talked about, but we've been touching on a little bit. Give me your 5-minute overview of what's happening there, and the same thing, the ceasefire claims, whether the validity of the bombings, whatever you think is most important to encapsulate before we have to run out of time here.
I think there's a few things to note there with the attack on Iran. Obviously, there is the international law and the disintegration of the United Nations and its charter on one hand, and then there's what actually happened. Perhaps I'll start with what happens, and we can summarize the implications on the international post-World War II system. When the Israelis launched their surprise attack, which is what it was not a preemptive attack because there's no evidence that there was anything to preempt. And it was in the midst of negotiations. When they launched their attack, I believe that the biggest mistake they made was they went after residential areas because they invited the largest possible Iranian response in the first round. But what Israel did is it thought, well, we can go after, and if you read all the think tanks and what they were saying, oh, Iran is so weak, and if Israel does X, Y, Z, then the Iranians will be put on the back foot and we can close this quickly, et cetera, et cetera. The Israelis went in and they assassinated essentially 30 generals, IRGC generals, and I think 7 scientists. And they took down residential buildings to do this. They believed that Iran, like Hezbollah, would be sort of knocked off balance by this and wouldn't be able to mount a considerable retaliation. Hezbollah, in their case, the strikes that eliminated its leadership, its senior leadership, and some of its middle command, it ended up putting it on the back foot. Hezbollah was still capable of surviving and fighting on the ground and repelling an Israeli incursion, but Hezbollah was seriously damaged. There's no question about it in that fighting. It was a blow. Now it's recovering, but it's different. Like the Israelis could go in and attack them in a way that nobody thought possible. The Iranians, they completely miscalculated. They thought that this blow was going to be, essentially a knockdown blow, and the Iranians weren't going to be able to find their footing. And even I spoke to a range of contacts, military contacts, some analysts, and then some ex-US military contacts. And they all told me the same thing. They said between 2 to 5 days, it's going to take Iran to just get back on its feet. Don't expect any retaliation anytime soon. All of this stuff. Iran's air defenses were taken offline for the first portion of that attack because of the fact that the Israelis have this vast network of collaborators on the ground inside of Iran, thousands of them that had worked, and most of the attacks in the end were actually carried out by Mossad agents and not by the Israelis themselves.
Really quickly, that you brought up in the past, by the way, you've mentioned this discussion about them using these sleeper elements inside of Iran. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. And this is something that I believe they were going to do in the event of attack. Something I didn't anticipate is how brazenly they went after civilian areas. Mm-hmm. And those images on the first day of like a dead toddler covered in ashes on the street and, a mother trapped under the rubble with her children, that radicalized the Iranian population. And in fact, the Israelis and their puppet Shah, the son of the Shah, this, monumental loser, to be honest with you, came out giving multiple speeches calling for an Iranian revolution, and the regime is collapsing. It's collapsing. Each day it was collapsing even more than it collapsed the previous day. And nobody in Iran even came out for a single protest in favor of this scumbag, who, by the way, even his father, somebody that is that openly a collaborator, even his father probably would have put him in one of his infamous torture centers for behaving in the way that he has behaved, as a side note. But they tried this, but the Iranian people stood behind their government because of the way that they were attacked. Even people that hate their government with a passion.
Right.
Many of them flipped because of the way that their civilian population was attacked. Iran, to everyone's surprise, got back on its feet, got its air defenses back online, replaced its generals, and launched a devastating missile attack in central Tel Aviv, which I was shocked watching it live on Al Mayadeen TV myself. Within 15 hours, they did all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israelis, I think, were taken back. It was just
Right.
missile wave after missile wave after missile wave. And suddenly, the streets of Tel Aviv looked like the streets of Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And Netanyahu came out, we're not going to allow this to be a war of attrition. We're not going to allow this to be a war of attrition. The United States gets involved very quickly, and then they've wound this down. In my opinion, this is not the end. This is not the end at all. This will definitely flare up again. The ceasefire agreement, it wasn't an agreement. It was just both sides just decided to stop
Right.
because
Right.
of Trump saying so.
Well, okay, good.
There's no actual written agreement.
Three things I want to ask you then before we go really quickly. So the what's your thought on the ceasefire? From my research, it seems that the statement was made by Trump, and he either was under the impression that somehow that was given to the Iranians, or he didn't care that it wasn't, and then nobody even knew about it, but they all kind of just agreed, like you're saying. Is that kind of what happened?
That's the impression that I've been given as well.
How
like
interesting. It's just such a weird thing to happen. It's just, you know, what do you think about Trump? Do you think, but I find it a weird way he did that. Like that to me gives me the feeling that he is being played in some way. Why do you think about that?
I feel like it is that. I think the Israelis are the ones that organized this because they wanted a ceasefire very desperately. You could see that their air defenses were collapsing, that Iran only had to fire 5 missiles to hit the targets that they wanted to towards the latter end of the 12 days. At the start, Iran had to fire like 200 missiles, to hit all of their targets. In one batch, I think they fired 50 and another 150 on the first day. And lots of them got caught by the air defenses. But after a while of just pounding away, those air defense systems were essentially null and void for smaller attacks. So the Israelis wanted to end it. And I think they just used Trump to end it because they wanted to get out of it. I think they wanted to experiment to see what would happen if the US attacked the nuclear facilities. Evidently, I think at this point, and I could be wrong, some new information could come out which completely debunks this. But I think the whole idea of the obliteration of the nuclear sites is utter nonsense. I don't think the Natanz facility seems to have been very badly damaged, but Fordo, I don't think so. Some of the above ground facilities were definitely taken out, but it's nothing Iran can't recover from. So
we have satellite imagery that show that. I mean, they've been caught, as far as I'm concerned, lying about the totality of it.
Yeah, exactly. And essentially what they've done is they've actually, forced Iran into a position where now it will accelerate its pace, at least in terms of enrichment, if not actually getting a nuclear weapon.
I think that's what Israel wanted from it, to be honest.
Maybe that could have been the case. I think that they part of this was experimental. Part of this was they tried a certain attack and it failed. Their missions failed. All of their missions failed. They didn't achieve anything, but they still are fixated on regime change, and they are going to continue to pursue regime change. And we would be naive to think otherwise. I don't think it's a real, I cannot see it being a lasting ceasefire, whether it disintegrates in a few days, in a few months, or in a year. At the end of the day, this is not a real agreement. It's just not. And I don't think this can hold for long, personally. I think that soon you're going to see more airstrikes in Tehran and more missile strikes in Tel Aviv. And that's going to be the way that this goes. But one thing I would say, and I wanted to note this before we end, is that this has been the complete disintegration of the international order post-World War II in the United Nations. You and the viewers of this program will probably remember that in 2003, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, came out and accused the United States of violating the UN Charter for attacking Iraq. Now, at that time, the UN Security Council had previously voted on a resolution condemning Iraq, but the United States failed to get the second resolution, which authorized the use of force against Iraq. Therefore, it was illegal. And the Secretary General of the United Nations said that the United States violated the UN Charter. there was at least some opposition. The protests in the street against the Iraq war were some of the biggest anti-war protests in human history.
Right.
This time, there was no, years of weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons that we gave to them, but hey, let's ignore the fact that we gave them the weapons. There's this propaganda campaign didn't exist. The public opposition, there were maybe a few hundred people protesting in Washington, D.C. when it happened. The United States and Israel both attacked Iran, a sovereign country, violating the UN Charter, both of them. And what did Antonio Guterres say? He expressed concern and he urged de-escalation, and he condemned all sides equally. His statement against Iran's retaliatory strike against the U.S. CENTCOM in El Ubaid airport in airbase in Qatar was more strong than the Israeli attack and the U.S. attack on Iran. The IAEA basically has been captured at this point by the Israelis and the Americans, and it does their bidding. The whole international order is gone. There's no grassroots anti-war movement anymore. The United Nations is null and void. Its charter is null and void. International law doesn't matter anymore. None of these countries stood up and went, wait, this is a violation of the UN Charter. Oh, wait, international law. We're in the law of the jungle. Right. That's where we're at. And this is the result of what happened in Gaza, where we normalize slaughtering hundreds of people, civilians, every single day, and nobody stands up against it. We normalize genocide, we normalize mass starvation, and all the human rights reports and all of the UN reports and the ICJ ruling, preliminary ruling, and the ICC warrants. The Rome Statute is dead. The ICC is dead. All the organs of the United Nations are essentially null and void and dead. The only influence that these, international bodies have is on public opinion. That's it. Right. They don't have an influence on anything else. So what Israel and the United States have done is put the final nails in the coffin of international law and the post-World War II order, which was created to stop, ideally, to stop the sort of atrocities that we saw during the Second World War, committed by all sides, but especially by the Nazis. So essentially what Israel has done, Israel has removed all of the safeguards put together by the world to prevent the resurgence of Nazi war crimes. That's what Israel has done. That's what Israel has done. And that's just the truth. Yeah,
it is. I mean, it's so obvious that this has been something that's been building for a long time. And to your point about the propaganda, I mean, I think it has sort of been there. We saw a really obvious ramp up and like a focal point of propaganda around WMDs. But as you cover, as we know, the building of propaganda around going after Iran has been going on for decades, and so this is interesting to see this sort of begin, if you want to say that. I mean, I do think this is the beginning of where this goes and this kind of final part of what they're trying to achieve. But I think what you've highlighted today and the information, I mean, it does give me hope again that you see this, and I do agree. I do think a lot of other people see these things, many people for the very first time. And I do think that is a hopeful moment. And even the point about like the international apparatus, the different mechanisms only essentially, influencing public opinion. I mean, what that shows me is everyone out there listening, the world, it requires your involvement, right? This is where we need to step in as the individuals and do whatever we think in our personal lives and our inner circles to try to point these things out, call out these truths, and see this, something start to begin in that direction, because that's the reality. Because if we're not pushing our local power structures to do what we want, or the different ways we at least pretend representative governments work, and we have lost, and we are failing on our duty from that perspective as well. But I think that one bigger thing we can see is a lot larger thing happening behind all of this. I think you very clearly highlighted all the manipulations through these things, but I think there's a bigger dynamic happening, like that all of this are different moving parts to something larger toward the end. And I think an example of that to end, and feel free to comment on this on the way out, is the foreknowledge of all this, the warning of Iran that appeared to be there, which we've seen in the past, right? The back channels around bombing the Iraq base in the U.S., but, that was discussed beforehand. In this case, I think it's been clearly shown that there was foreknowledge. It's somebody had warned. The B-2 bombers were publicly discussed. So it's not like Iran didn't see it coming, and then the in reverse, where Iran, I mean, Trump pulled people away from Iraq. The Qatar base was basically removed in regard to people and important assets, and then they bombed, right? And so clearly it was meant to be. So to me, that's sort of a coordination, and not to say necessarily all of them are on the same side. We should consider that, like in the COVID-19 dynamic where we saw them all kind of lockstep in the agenda. My simple point is that we make sure we're all out there seeing the parts we discussed today, but also where else it could be going. The bigger moving parts of sort of the globalist, Zionist, technocratic kind of awakening that we're seeing, or really just the mask coming off, and where that might be going, you know? So what, you know, the possible end game to what all this might lead to, you know? But thank you again for joining us and updating us, because it really, you have such a wealth of knowledge on this, Robert. And I think it's important for people to check out your work, whether that's on Last American Vagabond or Mint Press News, wherever it may be today. And I will say on the way out, then I'll let you say anything you'd like to on the way out as well, that more will be coming through TLAV from Robert. So look forward to that. So thanks for being here again, brother. Anything else you want to leave us with? Go ahead.
No, I'd just say, yeah, we have to wait and watch how things develop. It's very hard to predict things precisely, but yeah, you know, we might be surprised by the public and their reactions in the future. But right now, you know, I think there has been a lack of reaction to this, which has been quite shocking. But thank you for having me on. And as always, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, brother. And we'll be talking again soon. So everybody out there, as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.